another Good Dads podcast. I am Jay Fotsch alongside Jason Hynson from Victory Mission. Of course, we do the installment of The Intentional Dad, and with that, we welcome in Jim Robinette. We're going to be talking about the role of discipline in parenting, so that's why you've brought all different kinds of torture devices. Because when we say discipline, we're thinking of spanking and bull whips.
Yes.
Right? Is that probably
maybe
not. Yeah.
rods of various
rods? Yeah, all different kinds.
Don't
want
to spare those rods.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Jim, tell us a little bit about yourself. Obviously, we're not going to be going into those.
Yeah, that was all jokes. All jokes for everybody. Yes. Wait, what are they doing over there?
No props today.
Yeah, no props.
Well, a long time ago, I was born here in Springfield and raised in Springfield. Even though my dad was in the Army, so we did move away several times, but then we came back, and I was here as a kid growing up for quite a long stretch, which is unusual for an Army kid, but nonetheless, that's the way it went. And then had to move away my senior year, graduate from high school up in Wisconsin, but went to West Point, and then I was out in the Army for a long time, and then couldn't get enough of that, so I ended up teaching at West Point after I retired from being the lawyer there. I started off as an armor officer. The Army paid for me to go to law school at Notre Dame, which was a very good gig. And then I was an Army lawyer for a lot of years. Like I said, winding up at West Point where I retired and taught there for a year after I retired, and then went to Germany for a couple of years. And then kind of on the tail end of COVID, moved back here to Springfield in 21.
Okay.
And I've been not really... I've had a couple of full-time jobs since then, but I'm
disciplining. Disciplining people, not only just your kids, but just people in our community.
Yeah. Now I'm just part-time lawyering mostly, and
part-time lawyer,
and trying to, I'm always scheming about how to get to go see our grandson in Philadelphia and our Army kids in Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
Yeah. Because both your kids work for the military, or
that's right. Our older son, he's a major select, I think they call it in the Air Force, as opposed to captain promotable, but he's not yet pinned on the gold oak leaf, but he flies tankers for the Air Force and lives with his wife and our grandson in downtown Philadelphia. And she's a nurse practitioner and is very fortunate to be able to practice telemedicine, really complicated women's health kind of issues. And then our daughter, she's a West Point graduate, as is her husband. They're both in 3rd Brigade of the 101st Airborne at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Wow. And so we just got back from seeing them last weekend.
So your dad was in the military.
Correct.
You're in the military. Both your kids are in the military.
Right. Actually, my granddad was too, but he was only in the National Guard. Ended up getting mobilized to run a Civilian Conservation Corps camp in the Depression, but there's a long. I'm a Sons of the American Revolution guy. Going back to the Revolution. So
because I think this is the intentional dad, right? We're trying to understand like discipline, and I think when I think about military structure, high accountability, you do what you're told when you're told. If they say jump, you say how high, and all this kind of stuff, right? Kind of in these portraits of these movies and probably caricatures of our culture.
Very much so, because I think when I was, I think my parents were very laissez-faire. They were very much growing up in the 70s and 80s. I was a free range kid. I rode my bike all over Springfield from the time I was probably in 7th or 8th grade, and there was no cell phone. I mean, I just took off and maybe had a little money in my wallet, and maybe I didn't. And my grandparents lived up here by SMS, then, Missouri State. And so I would ride all over town, see my friends, go to my grandparents, come up to school for, basketball camp or whatever. And just, I was really off the hook in a way. I think that people today don't have really any, you see the memes on Instagram or whatever, but they don't have any idea of how free kids really were back in the day.
Okay, so this is interesting because you mentioned discipline, and you would think that you would have had a very disciplined childhood, but you're saying that that's the opposite.
Actually, it was very much the opposite. You
had to be free range kids.
Yeah, you had to be, and I think I don't think I was that free with my kids, but we lived on Army bases a lot when my kids were growing up. And so I knew that, you know, being on an Army base, you know, they were inside the fence line. They were safe, you know, so they ran around all over the place as kids, and they were very much free range kids as they growing up. To an extent, I think a lot of even their peers were not that free range and didn't have the ability to, you know, like when we lived in Hawaii, they could go to the shop ed and go get a snack. They could go to the commissary. They could go to the swimming pool. They could just walk there in their flip flops. Yeah, climb trees. Yeah.
Put a straw in it. I mean, that's what I think if you're in Hawaii, right?
The funny thing is that we had all these fruit trees, banana plants in the neighborhood where we lived.
Sure, that's right.
Some neighbors were really proprietary about the plant that happened to be in their yard, and other people, you know,
were annoyed that there was a banana.
Well, the mangoes actually, they would fall to the ground and they would rot and stink.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And
it's a tough life in island countries.
They right. That's right.
Oh, the mango.
But you know, so my kids had, you know, they were not super structured.
Right.
You know, in fact, the 2 years we lived in Hawaii, they were homeschooled.
Yeah.
And so, you know, about every 11 or 12 o'clock every morning, you know, some kids coming and knocking on the front door. Hey, can Zach and Haley come out and play now?
Yeah.
You know, because you're supposed to get your academics done in the morning. And then they had lots of free time, even though they had lots of other stuff to do, like, you know, music lessons, dance lessons, sailing in Pearl Harbor, art, co-op, all this kind of stuff. They still had a lot of unstructured time where they could just run around the neighborhood.
So basically, if my kids ever come to me and they're like, we're tired of being disciplined, I will just say, well, okay, then our whole family's joining the military.
Yeah.
We're going to go to an army base and we will be less disciplined.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing was my life was very disciplined. I had to get, you know, I had to be at PT at 6:30, you know, in formation every morning, you know, 5 days a week. But the kids kind of ran free. Now mom's riding herd on them. Right. You know, she knew what they were doing, and you know, and they did get cell phones when we were in Hawaii. So
what do you think about, like, because I think there's this interesting thing, like people would look at you, and I know your wife too, and like you guys are very successful, right? You've been an attorney, you've been at West Point, you know, very prestigious, graduated Notre Dame. But yet there's this concept of like, you kind of rode your bike all over. Like, it's almost like these, what do you think it was about that environment that sort of helped make you a disciplined individual? Well, because that's what we want, right? I think we want our kids to see that.
Well, I'll tell you my dad's mantra, his parenting mantra was take responsibility for your own actions. You are responsible for your own actions. You have to think about, you know, what you're doing and what's going to be the result of that, not only in the short term, but longer term.
Wow.
You know, and I think more than parenting, it was leadership that was kind of the key, you know, to make your kids think about, and I was the same way, except my mantra was phrased a little bit differently. Even though it had the same idea at the core, and that was make good choices. You know,
and if you do those things, it's almost kind of like maybe you don't have to be disciplined enough, or not enough, but you don't have to be disciplined enough if you were making those good choices, and then you kind of can have some free range.
Well, that's exactly right. The kids, when they understand that, and the thing that I talk to them, you know, in great length at different times. Obviously, when something went sideways, then we'd have a lot more in-depth conversations. But I'd say, listen, you know, let's think about what happened here. You know, you did not make a good choice. What happened? You know, if you continue making this not good choice, what do you think is going to happen? And we would talk about that. And it was very, you know, not to use a big word, but it was Socratic. You know, I was asking them to figure it out on their own. Yep. Asking them questions, engage your brain, you know, this is your action, you know, and giving the kids agency, because they are going to live their lives. We can, you know, as parents, you cannot live your kids' lives.
And I think even we give Cause like that responsibility word, I mean, like think about how many times somebody came on recently in a leadership position and was like, well, it was actually their fault, or there's like the apology, non-apology. Like, I'm sorry that I got caught. I wish I wouldn't have done it now that I got caught.
Yeah.
And you're like, wait, I don't feel like you're genuine. I feel like you're
that
mad.
doesn't sound like repentance.
Yeah. There's no change of thought or like, I wish I wouldn't have done that. It's more of like, sorry.
And that goes back to your point of personal responsibility.
Yeah. Personal.
Absolutely.
And accountability.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, like I say that, it's got to be age appropriate, obviously,
Right.
For wherever your kids are. That's the other thing. You have to figure out what motivates every kid.
So it wouldn't work for our 3-month-old.
No, not so much. Okay. Not so
Hey,
much.
give
What about
that
our
baby
6-year-old?
agency. Just leave them in the crib. They'll be fine.
I hope he's mowing within the next year or two.
But I mean,
With the grass right now. It's good.
we had our son, if you gave this kid a timeout as a punishment, it's literally, it's like the thing he's an introvert. He loves to read. He loves to draw, but
so that wouldn't be a punishment.
It's not a punishment, not at all. But if you were to say to him, just very calmly, I'm very disappointed in you. That's crushing. Because he has that, type A, I want to do
driven.
well. I want to do well. I want to be a good kid in him, whereas our daughter, she doesn't care what anybody thinks. I mean, obviously she does now. She's in the Army. She's a captain, she understands that her reputation matters, but when she was a kid, I mean, she'd get in trouble at school all the time for talking, and the teacher never really, this one particular teacher up in New York never really knew how to handle her, but her, you could put in timeout and it was like torture because she was super extroverted. She wanted to be out there playing with her friends,
So even the consequences, I remember I was in childcare for a few years with, kids that weren't my kids.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can't do the same practices, right? It's like, you almost have to do that. It's like, you got to play psychology. You got to throw all this, because really it's setting that bar. What I hear you saying, your dad set a high bar. And if you did not come home or didn't follow through, he was like, well, you didn't take responsibility. It was almost like, we've kind of lost those, and we make it, well, it's the video game's fault, it's your peers' fault, it's social media's fault.
Right.
Why can't we just say, well, I made a dumb thing.
Yeah.
I made a poor choice and I had a poor consequence. Because consequences could be good and bad, right? You go to a job, you get paid. You don't go to a job, you don't get paid.
Well, you were talking about parenting, or having to ride herd on kids that were not your own.
Yeah.
That's one thing that I've always thought, the zero tolerance policy is like, if some kid does X, we're always going to do Y.
Right.
I think that's okay. So you're just deciding that in these circumstances, you're going to check your brain. You're not going to engage your brain in what's appropriate for that kid in those circumstances. It's really good. Because, I'm a big, this is not a political statement. This is just Jim's personal philosophy. I don't think there's any such thing as social justice. There's individual justice, and it's always got to be retail for that person in those circumstances, what's appropriate. And that goes with parenting too. You've got to try and make things even your kids. You can't play favorites among your kids. You've got to be the disinterested, judge, between your kids. But at the same time, you've got to be able to
parent them differently.
Yeah, you've got to be able to.
Because they're two different, because just what you said, they're two different personalities.
But there is a concept of equity that's got to come in, where you're going to treat them fairly. Yeah. I remember one time I got in trouble as a cadet at West Point. And I ended up having to walk punishment tours in the wintertime outside. It's basically like walking a guard post. You couldn't wear anything on your ears, and it was January and the wind's blowing. And I told my tactical officer who ended up working here in Springfield, Kent Thomas. He passed away last year, unfortunately. But I remember telling him, I'm like, this is not fair. He's like, well, you don't expect life to be fair, do you? And I said, I don't expect life to be fair. I expect you to be fair. And I think that's what kids expect from their parents. They expect their parents to be fair.
Yep.
This Good Dads podcast is brought to you in part by our generous supporters. This week, we'd like to thank the following: Prime Inc., Lorenz Plumbing, Heating and Air, Flint Rock Home Builders, Springfield Sign, Mercy Hospital. Thank you to all of our sponsors. Visit our website at gooddads.com to learn how to contribute to the Good Dads mission. Okay, so that kind of brings us to our next point. Dads don't just discipline, they need to be disciplined. And I'll ask both of you, whoever wants to take it first, Jason and or Jim, what does that mean for you guys?
I mean, for me, I think you lead by example. One of the things Jim just said was like leadership. You know, I can't expect something from my kids that I'm not like at least have the awareness and insight to step into myself.
Yeah.
And I think even what I see, you know, cause I work with people a lot of times in generational poverty coming out and, you know, they have the opposite where nobody had any success. It's always someone else's fault. And as long as I have that mindset, then I don't have to take responsibility. So if I don't have to take responsibility, then why does it matter? You know, and you get in that kind of lackadaisical approach. So like for me, like I want my kids to be disciplined, then I need to be disciplined myself. And I get up at a certain time and I have a certain routine and then I'm teaching that, you know, because we used to say that in childcare a lot, like things are caught, not taught. So like they're going to do what you do, not do what you say. And we so much want to do it the opposite. Like, well, don't follow me. Remember? Anyway, there was that commercial, like I learned it from watching you, Dad, like the kid that was like using drugs.
Where did you get this?
Yeah.
Where did you find this?
Yeah. From you. You know,
where did you know how to do this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you would add anything to that.
Well, I would
just say no to drugs.
Yeah,
commercial.
80s,
I got you, man.
I would say there's two aspects of this that at least I tried to live, and that was to be accountable.
Oh, that's good.
To the lead, you know, and that goes to, you know, both my wife and my kids. There were times when I was parenting my kids when I made the wrong call, and I had to be willing to own that to them.
Did you say you asked for forgiveness? Maybe
Yes.
I think that's huge. I did that literally yesterday. I was trying to protect our little girl from not from our 10-year-old. They just sometimes our older kids, they run their mouth too much and they like want to be like junior parent. And it was just like, hey, the 3-year-old doesn't need to know that spilling the dog food, like she knows she made a mistake. She knows somebody's picking it up.
Right.
So to have another kid be like, you spilled the dog food, you know, and it's like, it was just like, like, stop it. And I probably was a little bit too like, stop it. Yeah. But I'm like, how many times have we told you, please just, it's okay. Right? She's 3.
Yeah.
She spilled the dog food. That's what 3-year-olds do.
Yeah.
So it's not like, it's like, hey, help dad clean it up or,
hey,
I'll just clean it up. I mean, the chickens are going to come eat it or the dogs are going to come eat it. They'll be fine. Somebody's coming to eat it. It's okay. So,
well, the other thing I would say is that I was always involved with a group of men outside of my family and we sort of held each other accountable and talked about what we were going through in our lives.
Like a faith community.
Or good dads.
Yeah, good dads.
Good dads.
We obviously talk about that a lot. Like
good dads. Yeah.
No, I mean, really, I mean, that's why this organization was founded, really, is for, you know, dads to support other dads.
Yeah.
And just as simple as what you just said.
Yeah.
Whether that's coffee, just getting on the phone and talking to somebody, just having some like-minded people that are going through the same thing as you.
Absolutely. And, you know, what's that proverb about, you know, wisdom comes through many counselors, you know?
That's good.
So how can parents work together with discipline in particular? So we you know, you kind of mentioned talking to other dads, you know, as we mention a lot of times on these podcasts, but specifically since today is the role of discipline in parenting, how and what have your guys' experience been in sharing something on this subject with other dads?
Well, I would say to the extent that you possibly can, and I understand if the parents are no longer married or never were married to each other, that this is very difficult, but to the extent that you possibly can, if you can get on the same page, you know, so that there's consistency. And I know a lot of times, you know, there's, you know, moms and dads shooting at each other, but to the extent that you can not ever do that in front of the kids.
Right.
I mean, that just does damage.
A united front. Really.
Yes. Yeah. To the extent that you can build a united front, and the parents back each other up on disciplinary calls with the kids. You can't have the parents undermining each other.
Yeah.
With respect to the kids and discipline, or discipline really goes by the board.
Would that be like, I think what I hear you saying is consistency, right?
100%.
I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
it's like, hey, this is what time you need to be home. If you're not home, then there might be a predetermined consequence. I mean, we've even had that, like, if you're not home, on time, then the next time, we're going to go times 10 the next day or something, or.
Well, another thing, I actually use this in a work concept too, but I mean, there's this idea that, you need to put people on notice when they're starting to go astray. You need to say, hey, you need to think about what you're doing here. This isn't right. Before, to the extent that you can, sort of check the behavior before it becomes too late. As opposed to, dads, we like to, be the strong silent type and then wait until,
they stick their finger in the light socket.
Yeah. And then it's like
it's like that old saying, like, I'll just let him stick it in there and learn his lesson. And
yeah.
Right,
touch the hot stove, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And to the, you've got to get them to engage their brain about those consequences and their agency and responsibility for their actions and the consequences.
Explain that agency piece. Like,
well, I mean, it's the whole, Invictus, being the captain of your own fate. Now, obviously things happen, but the kid has a choice about how to react to circumstances, and then how they act. Whatever circumstances they're responsible for what they think and what they do, and what they do reflects what they think. So, if you can get them to think about what they're doing before they do it, as opposed to just, acting out of the id, then, I think that kids are going to be better off.
Yeah.
Get them to think a little bit strategically. They'll just be so much better off in life.
I even hear that concept of like problem solving, right? Like, hey, I really want to do this later. I mean, it goes back to, do you guys remember the marshmallow test where they gave these kids marshmallows in like a psychology test?
I think I missed that.
They were like little kids, and this is like a really famous, and they gave them one. And And if they waited like 5 minutes,
they got more.
Then they got another one. And so it was like delayed gratification.
Yeah.
And I think even what that is so much of our culture is just instant.
Yeah.
Right? Like if I want it, I'll go get it. If you
with
want to take it, everything.
Not just
with adults. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, very much so.
We're like, we have. Like,
I want an Oompa Loompa now.
Yes, that's right. Oh my gosh, Willy Wonka reference. That was great. My dad.
The only thing I want now, as a matter of fact.
That's so funny. But I think that's also with discipline. You're essentially teaching them to think. You're teaching them to problem solve. You're teaching them to have delayed gratification. It's like a whole concept. So discipline is really, we do think punishment. Right? So quickly we think punishment with discipline, but really it's a lifestyle that's sort of in self-control, self-aware.
Yeah.
They're aware of others around them, how my actions affect them. I'm taking responsibility. It's all those, it's like bigger concepts than that. So it becomes more like 30,000, but like, oh.
No, you're right. And I mean, even when we started this podcast off and we were joking, when you hear the word discipline,
for
you
sure.
think of the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
And
whips and chains.
Well, no, I'm serious. And like, even as a kid, like I hear that word right now and I'm thinking of myself as a kid and I'm like, this does not sound good.
Yeah.
That means I'm in the principal's office again.
Yeah.
That means I'm getting disciplined again. And
I mean, some kids, not necessarily.
not necessarily me. I'm just for whoever happens. But you're right. Discipline is, it's so much more than that.
Yeah, it is.
Absolutely.
And that's why I think that concept of like, even in an environment, when you put people in an environment where other people are all sort of in self-aware and self-controlled, then we respond that way. And it's like that, like group think thing, when somebody's like, it's the old run on the bank. Remember Mary Poppins?
Oh yeah.
When like the kid wouldn't give somebody the tuppence and they're like, they won't give him their money back. And then next thing you know, everybody wants their money because somebody didn't get it. And it's like, what just happened? Yeah. It's like we created chaos.
So how is discipline related in some of these, everyday aspects, whether that be habits, routines, or structure? Kind of a little bit of kind of what you're saying, and why do kids need that routine?
Well, I think structure is very important. You've got to have.
Well, you're military.
Yeah, I mean,
we know.
I was the military, career military officer.
I feel like I've been slouching.
Sit up
I'm
straight.
sorry, Jim.
I feel like I am slouching. But yeah, I mean, you've got to have some structure. Even though, and that was one thing that I realized. Kids have to know what the boundaries are, and then give them freedom within those boundaries. To the maximal extent that they can, because that's the way they're going to learn.
They feel safe in that too.
Yeah,
There's like this felt safety.
No, exactly.
And a lot of people would hear that and they go, "Well, isn't that contradictory?"
No, it's
like,
absolutely
how can
not.
you be? No, I know, but like a lot of people will hear you say, you can be free within these boundaries and structure. And as soon as you say boundaries and structure, it automatically cuts off the freedom. But going back to something you mentioned earlier on in the podcast of growing up or your kids growing up in the Army banks, of having that structure and boundaries, but yet being free. Same thing with your child.
Yeah.
You had that structure and boundaries, however you were free.
And
so I think both of those do work. I think a lot of people would push back at that and say it's contradictory, but I agree with you.
No, it's a little bit Zen, but I mean, I think
it's good.
There is very much, if kids, but they have to know what they are. You have to communicate what those boundaries are. And that's why I was saying you need to give them notice. If you see them heading in a way, that's off track, you've got to put them on notice. Hey, this is the boundary. Remember, we talked about this, that kind of thing.
It's interesting you say that. My 15-year-old and I were talking and we were kind of discussing that piece. And he was like, listen, I try to make it, the problem is outside of us, right? It's like you put it as a piece of paper outside. Hey, here's the problem. Let's look at it together. And how can I be your guide? How can I be like a mentor? And let's talk about how we solve this together. And we were kind of walking through, I don't remember the exact details of what we were talking about, but it was something with, probably use of a device or something like that, where it's like, if someone's in the room, like, the courtesy thing is like to not be on your device when you're talking to somebody, different things like that. And all those different facets and or curfew or any things like that. But when you look at the problem kind of together, shoulder to shoulder, then you're not in opposition. You're sort of team. You become, let's look at this, solve it together. Let's figure out how you're not frustrated with me and I'm not frustrated with you. We're not at odds. We really want the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's back to that agency creating, and you got to kind of grow that up. But, at some point you've got to start to think about how do you give them more, rope, if you will, to be able to like, I'd much rather my kids make mistakes in my house. And I think about that now. I don't know. I probably over controlled my oldest. And like, as we're getting down to it, like maybe I'm getting to be a better parent. I got more experience, because you start to realize like, man, I probably was too controlling here. And so I think for us, even that discipline piece or self-awareness, man, I can still be growing. I can still be changing too. And like, and to be transparent about, man, I probably screwed that up. And then be like, yeah, you did, Dad. And you're like, well, okay, let's not go overboard.
It's your fault. It's your fault for setting those boundaries.
That's right.
I didn't set these boundaries, Dad.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah,
that's it.
But having that discussion, like not essentially adults, but giving them where they can be. Hey, you're going to be adults someday. You got to make these decisions, and I might not be there.
Yeah. And as they get older, more and more, you're not going to be there.
That's right.
And you've got to equip them with what to do when you're not there.
Yeah. Because they're going to get a car.
Right.
And they're going to have their own money. Uh-huh. And they're going to feel like they don't need you anymore. And it's
they're going to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend.
I was going to say, there's going to be that L word.
Yeah.
They're going to fall in love and make silly decisions.
Yeah.
And not be thinking with the mind that
the heart wants what it wants.
All right, fellas. Is there any more closing things on discipline? Of course, the roles of discipline and parenting that maybe we didn't hit today that you would like to close with?
I think that's it. I think if you can get kids to think lead them to think and make good choices. Ask a lot of questions. What did you think was going to happen here? I think you'll go far.
I think it's great. I think you started with a great one. I think that personal responsibility, like just having them own their decisions, own their behavior, and then, hey, let's do it different next time. I mean, it's almost like you're almost just doing a reactive thing. Let's look at that again. And what would you do differently maybe if you had a different choice? And I think even talking through that could give them insight for the next time.
And be accountable as a dad.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, be reflective yourself and be willing to say, hey, I messed up.
Yeah.
I think that
sometimes we don't react well.
There's humility in that.
Indeed. Personal accountability.
Yeah.
So if you did not like this podcast, blame these two.
That's right.
Did I hear that right?
You got it. You got it.
Oh, I'll keep practicing.
It'll be the Spider-Man standoff.
There you go.
Everybody point at everybody else.
Jim Robinette, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks
and
for
of
having
course, Jason Hynson from Victory Mission.
Yep.
Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you.